Hey everybody and welcome to Bits of Board, where we're talking board games, miniatures, cards and dice. My name's Michael and today we are finally doing a review for Sword and Sorcery Ancient Chronicles. Now for those that don't know about this game, it is a sequel to the original Sword and Sorcery that kickstarted with honours back in 2015. This was a high fantasy adventure game that had its fair share of exploration and dungeon crawling and pit players up against some very mean monsters in the process. It was a narrative-driven experience, ushering players through a storyline split into parts between the base game and its expansions. Sword and Sorcery Ancient Chronicles, this standalone expansion, offers much of the same experience with new monsters and narrative chock full of quests with only a few variations on the old formula. Players still control their heroes, still romp around the map, and still engage in rich dice-driven combat, which, safe to say, borrows just a few elements from older dungeon crawl games around, like Descent, whereby rolled dice not only show the outcome of an attack, but also grant opportunities to utilize extra abilities found on carried items, weapons, and armor equipped. Unlike games like Descent though, the enemy figures are controlled all by the game's AI, with monsters activating after each hero. The game is tense and players can quickly become overwhelmed by the ferocity of the monster forces, but the game is never unfairly weighted against you, and players should know going in that hero death is not actually a sign of poor play, and that even a handful of deaths won't spell defeat or make a quest unwinnable, with options to resurrect right around the corner from each death. The Ancient Chronicles base game, like its predecessors, contains about half of the full storyline, but don't go ahead thinking that it's only half of the full experience. There is still a fully fleshed out adventure here, it's just there's going to be more to do later. And also, you're kind of level capped and unable to gain new character powers after a certain point. Fear not though, that is when loot comes in and there are plenty of opportunities to improve your character with gear. All the other character stuff will unlock in the next expansion. Beyond gameplay, Ancient Chronicles does just about everything it needs to transport you, the player, into the Underreign, the dark and mysterious world at which this campaign takes place. When setting up a quest, you only know the bare essentials of what's going on, and there's always a lot to be uncovered through exploration. There are randomized events like composition of monsters, order of events, and on top of that we usually have a few elements hidden from setup, details of which contained within the campaign's Book of Secrets. Think of it like a structured choose-your-own-adventure novel companion for the game. Now, pause. If this seems like a game for you, you want to see it in action, I've had a playthrough running for this one covering the first 3 quests of the game. If you want to go see it in action, please go check it out. But pay attention to the comments for when I mess up because, well, more on that later. Unpause. I will begin by saying Sword and Sorcery is one of the finest high fantasy adventure games around. Of its ilk, we have Descent, probably its closest relative, a very long-running adventure game series from Fantasy Flight Games. It's coming into its 3rd edition now, but this is one of those games where hero players have to go up against another player controlling the monsters. Sword and Sorcery, you don't have to worry about that, and all of those monsters are handled with the game's AI. Next we have Madara, which differs a little in theme, but offers a similar gameplay experience with dice-driven combat, loot exploration, branching objectives, and narrative, and tons of it. Then of course we have all of the Gloomhavens, which pretty much share no mechanics except for the story-driven adventure side of things. And then let's say we've got Zombicide Black Plague, which has all the dice rolling, but a less focus on what I would call progression and story. Now, these games will come back to a little later along with my recommendations, but if you've played one or another in there, it's definitely going to help paint the picture of Ancient Chronicles by the end of the review. Now, before we get into the actual meat and veg of the review, let's first take a look at that game loop overview. Over the course of a single quest, you will complete 3 phases of gameplay multiple times over and over again until the quest is either won or lost. A quest is lost by running out of event cards or experiencing a total party wipe, with all characters reduced to 0 hit points, not being resurrected in time. Victory conditions, on the other hand, are pretty much handled however the quest defines it, but it's often a result of exploration, killing a boss, or reaching a total amount of time spent in quest. The first phase is the time phase. Here players will refresh their unique powers and abilities and resolve effects like poison and bleed if they've been inflicted. Heroes can also soul level up here if they've gained enough souls, and they may resurrect if they are dead and nearby a shrine. The time phase acts as a kind of cleanup phase, after which play moves into the battle phase, whereby each hero will take a hero turn and then draw an encounter card, which will most likely activate one or more enemies situated on the map, beginning an enemy turn. During a hero turn, a player can take one movement action and a number of combat and action activities as determined by the level of the hero. And spoiler alert here, for the base game, this is going to be one or two activities. Movement is kind of self-explanatory. You move your character across the map. The fun part here, though, is that your movement can actually be interrupted with any number of action activities or free actions, helping maintain the game's flow. But if you stop to use an attack activity, your movement is done. Action activities encompass a number of interactions a player can have with the game world. They can open chests and lock doors, and they can even search. On top of that, actions can also increase a hero's ability in one area or another. Heroes can dash to extend their movement activation by one space, they can focus to ensure +1 hit when they attack, or they can pray at a shrine for divine powers. So aside from those two, the attack activity is next, and it's primarily used to activate a weapon currently equipped. You roll the dice as per the weapon, and then your target rolls defense. Defense involves multiple stages of resolution, but all in all it's quite nice and covers a rich array of attack effects available in the game. Basically though, for every hit rolled, you get a hit that the defender will need to defend against, with all other symbols allowing the player to activate abilities on their equipment if available. Once a player turn is done, if there are enemies on the map, the player draws and resolves an encounter card, and most of the time one or more enemies will activate. For each enemy, you go to their enemy scroll and check their AI. Basically, you check each range condition, and as soon as one is met by at least one hero, you finalize the target and carry out the attack instructions as listed. For the enemy, this may involve movement, activation of abilities, attacks, and other modifiers printed on the scroll. Once complete, if there are more enemies to activate, you activate them next, and if all activations have been carried out, you move on to the next hero turn. Noting here that turn order is not fixed, but once a hero is activated during the battle phase, they may not activate again until next turn. Moving on though, once all heroes have activated, the event phase begins, and the top card of the event deck is resolved. If the card is face down, it's flipped, resolved, and returned face up to the pile, with some of the events that might come up being spawning of monsters, treasures, or traps. And in some cases, you're even directed to the Book of Secrets to uncover a hidden part of the story driving the narrative. On the other hand, if the event card on the top is already face down, the card is simply discarded, basically meaning that you get a new event roughly every 2 rounds of gameplay. There are some exceptions though, and as I mentioned, if the event cards are ever run out, the game is over and you're lost. But that's pretty much it. You move back to the time phase and do it all again. That's the gameplay loop. Fairly simple, right? Right? Let's just say the game throws in some added complexities, which is good, but the frogate is also cursed. Review time. Sword and Sorcery Ancient Chronicles, along with the original game, has created probably one of the best high fantasy narrative adventures out there. It's a camp yet serious, a fun adventure that takes our heroes through a slew of different settings where they meet all kinds of characters and enemies abound. The fact that you can set up for a game and actually be surprised when things pop out at you, that is definitely worthy of a ton of praise, because often when you play some epic board game, there feels like there's this build throughout, it goes up and up and up, and then snap, the game is over, and the narrative that you've built with all the gameplay just falls apart and becomes meaningless because that's it. That situation I don't find happens here, and while almost all of the quests lead to another, the inclusion of an ending paragraph from the Book of Secrets does wonders in bringing a fitting conclusion to the quest as a whole, even if you play as a one-shot, although it does make you want to play the next one. The quality of writing is a bit meh. Content is great and it's exciting, but if I hear one more character utter the words cursed elves, I might flip. But like I said, it's camp, it's pulpy, I like it. So let's move away from the narrative, move into the actual drive of the game. What makes you want to play it? Because narrative is great and all, but read a book, watch a movie. Here I want to talk about those gameplay drivers. It's pretty damn good. Let's be real, even if there was no story here, I would have a great time simply chasing the betterment of my heroes. That upgrade loop of dungeon crawling and purchasing better equipment, leveling up, finding treasure, it's done really well here and without relying on the separation of equipment too, which is a killer. Another game I mentioned, Madara, it has a different loot deck for each level of hero and each type of equipment that you can find, and it's crazy and requires a bunch of extra setup and organization. And while it allows for some really focused character progression, I feel like that extra bookkeeping and organization is something that Sword and Sorcery really doesn't need. But that's okay. Sword and Sorcery's loot progression is simplified somewhat and still allows for some very good character customization. My rough interpretation of this loot system is at level 1 you utilize the standard equipment from the stash, and if you can afford it, from the world store, the Emporium. At level 2 you begin to purchase better equipment and reforge your old equipment to become more powerful, making you more likely to survive to level 3. At level 3, you finally get to make use of the treasure that you've looted from your journeys, noting here that you've had the opportunity to collect this treasure the whole time way back from level 1. So hopefully you've been able to assess what you have, decide who will use it, and what powers you should pick to complement the selection. Then finally, at level 4, the highest level for the base game, you'll be able to refine what you have to fill in the gaps that you've missed along your journey. To me, this progression just makes so much sense. The game forces you to engage with its different systems to be able to survive, and I think it's just such a clever and elegant bit of game design. I hate using elegant. But yeah, it's actually a lot of fun to see your hero get stronger, and any grind that you have to get that progression, it's worthwhile. So what about mechanics? That gameplay loop we went through earlier, time phase, battle phase, event phase, it's a real nice way of organizing all the different pieces of information you have to manage each quest. Sometimes the game system injects something else under one of those headings, but more often than not, it is very manageable. The combat loop though, on the surface, the dice-driven combat is smooth. Roll for hits, activate powers, crush defense. It's simple with a few layers, but really enjoyable on its own. Like that main gameplay loop, the game system also likes to inject extra bits and pieces into the combat loop as well. And sometimes I really wish those elements could be much more streamlined. See, I have this thing, and you can see it firsthand in the playthrough, that I just don't deal well with having to go back and forth between the reference and resolution. It's improved with practice, especially getting back into a Sword and Sorcery title, but I feel it's still something worth mentioning here. See, a lot of the time, Ancient Chronicles asks you to complete a series of actions in resolving an enemy attack, for example. The order of these actions is key, as resolution of the first may determine something relevant for the next, and so on. So you have to do the thing, carry out all the things relating to the thing, and then return to the reference, continue doing the next thing. For me, I found myself struggling to come back from the reference because what all games have taught me is that you roll and resolve and you're done, and that's good flow. Unfortunately, Sword and Sorcery is just not that simple, and it achieves a lot for it, but I feel like the flow of the game suffers because of it. On top of that, the game also expects you to remember key pieces of information that are not obviously telegraphed through running of its gameplay loops. For example, some enemies have a constant effect in play, some have things that only come up when they defend, some only when they attack, some only when they attack with a specific weapon, some only when they attack at night. You guys know who I'm talking about. The biggest culprit here is my mate, the Hobgremlin, an enemy that I constantly overlooked through my YouTube playthrough. Let's take a look at him. Here we have the Hobgremlin's AI, just a few basic sentences for each range of attack. Below that we have his additional rules. Here, if the Hobgremlin is attacked, we should check its Craven ability. As a part of the attack, we as players need to be aware of whether or not the enemy is in control of the area which they're defending. If they are, they go from having no defense to some defense, which is actually a pretty big difference in game. Simple, it's referenced, no worries. Moving on though, we have two conditions to check when the hobgremlin attacks. If it attacks with its stone blade, we action robber, and the defending player must make a save or discard a random card in their inventory, ignoring the fact that this effect is a pet peeve for me in any game. Still, it also has bestial hunger, an ability that affects only the hobgremlin's bite attack, and only if the attack is made at night, which is one of the event cards that may be drawn and in play. My complaint here, aside from any fiddliness, is that while each power relates to a specific attack from the monster, neither of these powers are referenced in the actual attack portion of the card. There is no telegraphing. These are just things that you are expected to remember on top of everything else that the game is throwing at you. And what's worse with this guy, having a look at bestial hunger, if the bite wounds at night, the hobgremlin is granted an enemy power. And what's an enemy power, you ask? Oh, it's just an additional set of rules that you have to bear in mind whenever you activate the monster. And they're random. It could be anything. All I'm saying is that there is a lot to look out for. I mean, let's take it just a normal situation. Let's say we draw the activate 3 enemies encounter card. The hobgremlin might just be one of these 3 enemies. You still have 2 others to work out when resolving one encounter. Now, personally, I'm just a little salty here because I play Sword and Sorcery solo, and this is a lot to remember for one guy. I will note that usually in a full game with real people, monsters are handled throughout the group, so players only really have to be aware of maybe one set of monsters at a time. It's actually not that bad. It's just I needed to vent and probably warn some solo players about the bookkeeping required here. Basically, returning to my point, Ancient Chronicles starts you off with this nice, clean system of doing things, and then it messes it up for you as you get more and more into the excitement. The more enemies you face, the tougher your competition, the more you need to make notes, check your calculations, and be sure that you're doing the right things exactly when the game wants you to do them. For me, this is when the game should be at its quickest and its most frantic, because it represents the most exciting elements of gameplay. Unfortunately though, it grinds down to a slow chug. But it is a meticulous chug. One that allows for some really interesting monsters, really unique critters that behave all these different ways. And if you can get your head around it, and if you can take that bookkeeping in stride, you are going to feel so damn good moving through this campaign, filled with the unique life that it is. Now, this of course extends out further than the combat loop. There are a number of elements of gameplay that need to be modified by pop-up rules just all the time. We have conditions to be aware of, minion activations, which be aware are separate to monsters. And in some cases, there are even some quest-specific changes, all of which need to be internalized to play this game smoothly. But play it you will. But what about post-game? You've played through the campaign, what next? I would say play it again, experiment with your character builds. Each hero has 2 different alignments, each with different powers available to them, and causes different in-game effects, including story narrative ones as well. There are 5 heroes in the base box, and even if you're playing a 4-player game, that 1 hero change-up will affect the party dynamic. Actually, a very quick side note here on the hero count. I'm not a fan of less than 4 heroes on the board, because of the way that the game scales with the different hero counts. Monster density just sucks under 4 players. You're pretty much spawning half of the monsters, and it just doesn't feel nearly as epic as it should. Just that's the aside there. Back into replayability, and this will go to anyone that's actually replayed a campaign style game. Sword and Sorcery is no different. You are going to know on that second playthrough where everything is. You'll know the story events, you'll know what equipment to bring and how to tackle the different monsters. Yes, there are still a number of randomized elements, but there's nothing that's going to scream out shock value when it comes out. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Story-wise, it's just like watching a movie for the second time, and gameplay-wise, it just changes the way that you play. Your actions become more directed and focused, and while you can still take the opportunity to explore missed opportunities and fix past mistakes, it's probably more fun creating efficient killing machines by tackling each scenario with knowledge as your main weapon. Now, just to be clear here, there are only two real ways to play the game post-campaign. You can play it one-shots or you can play the campaign again. There are no procedurally random generated dungeons here, and I feel like it would be very tough to make your own scenarios just because of the way balancing with monster powers and stuff works. The difficulty could just go anywhere. Good luck if you try though. Actually, speaking of difficulty, there are ways to make the game easier and harder in the box, which is really handy for that second playthrough, but I would stick with normal difficulty and no easier, especially for your first games. It really makes you make use of the systems at hand for survivability, rather than relying on good dice rolls. Worth noting here that there is also a paid option, being the challenge set, which kind of expands how the monsters work. Pretty sure it's going to be available at retail, if not, definitely through their web store or the next Kickstarter probably. Finally, what is always the elephant in the room with these kinds of games? Yes, it's a dice chucker and it relies on luck like nothing else, but only if you're expecting to get through a quest without dying. There are going to be some epic fails in there, but on the flip side, there are going to be some brutal kills. And that randomness, its only purpose is to build tension and create interesting situations where you really have to puzzle out the best way to attack. In no way here does luck ever get in the way of a well-earned win. And for victory, you only really need to be aware of the tools at your character's disposal. Weapons, armor, and most importantly, those hero powers. So for you guys, the difference between me recommending this game whole of heart is whether or not you actually want to take the time to get the game details right. Here I ask if you really want to dig in and familiarize yourselves with the monsters and heroes you control. If your answer is yes, great. Get this, get the first one. You will love them. If it's maybe, then that's cool too. Get the first one and build yourself up to it. My bookkeeping complaints for that first one are far less of a problem than there are here. For no's, but you still want an adventure or a fantasy style game, let's revisit those games I mentioned earlier. Descent, I said, was one of its closest relatives, but personally, I'm probably not going back to Descent. Sword and Sorcery has been a complete replacement for me as far as look and feel, and while the gameplay mechanics are different, I would much prefer to battle it out with this one. Maybe the third edition will be a game changer, but I'm happy to wait and see there. No rush. The next option is Madara, which shares a lot of similarities gameplay-wise. AI monsters, dungeon crawling, adventure. To me, it's probably a more streamlined experience, but in a good way, where any corners cut actually improve the gameplay and storytelling experience. It is very anime though, and way more over the top as far as campy goodness goes. Killer game though, so if you're into that sort of thing, there's probably no better alternative. Gloomhaven was next, and that's the game that you should play if you want to play a fantasy game, but also want to do math and logic problems at the same time. It has exploration and adventure for days, just without the dice chucking and more headaches. Alright, probably same amount of headaches, but different reasons. Speaking of dice chucking and headaches, if you want to play a board game with your mates, be set up, ready to play in 20 minutes with a rules explanation and beer in hand, Zombicide Black Plague is an absolute goer. It's a medieval zombie survival mayhem game, and it's chock full of these classic social situations that you can put together, like leaving your mates to die on the sly and stuff. A lot of fun. Like I said though, there's probably a lot less to think about there. Sword and Sorcery Ancient Chronicles is a more than worthy successor to the first game. It builds upon pretty much everything where it can, and it takes the approach, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and try and make it more complex if you can. This complexity is both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the game can handle a bunch of new monster behaviors and situations. On the other, the game sometimes feels bogged down if you don't have the patience to slow down with it and take it all in. Games are long, but not overly slow, and if everyone knows what they're doing, you can get to it in around 2 hours per quest, plus minus 30 minutes depending on the quest, but expect to double that if you're soloing, triple if you're filming. Components are great, although you're going to want a tackle box to separate all the bits for ease of access, and the minis are all of a great level of detail, if not a little plasticky, but they bend rather than break, so I'm a fan. It's definitely my go-to fantasy dungeon crawler game, and if it weren't for Madara, there would be no other competition for me. I've heard it described as Dungeons and Dragons in a box, and I would say it's probably the closest thing out there, especially when comparing game time to world time when in combat. Look, I think that'll about do it there, guys and gals. There are some things that I've only glossed over here, but I think I've gone over what I need to for you to know if the game is something that you're interested in pursuing. If you do want to know more though, hit me up in the comments below. But besides that, we are done. Do me a favor though, smash that like button, subscribe for more content. I'm out of here. My name's Michael. This is Bits Aboard. We'll catch you next time.